This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want Magic singles or sealed product, use my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Neetsahone, and it's Saturday. That means it's time for Neetsa Notes, my weekly vlog series about limited Magic. We're still in the relatively early days of Avatar: The Last Airbender Limited, but we have enough data and I have enough experience with the format that now I can take a look at things and say, here's what I got wrong and why. This is an exercise I always do after a set review and after I've had enough time to play the format, because I think it's useful both for me, to think about card evaluation, how format-specific things impact things, but I think it's useful for all of you too for the same reasons. Plus, it helps me update you on things where I steered you a little bit wrong in the set review, so that's beneficial too. Overall, I do think I did pretty well in this set, in terms of most of the cards that are the best cards in the set are cards that I thought would be good. Most of the cards that are the worst cards in the set, I didn't think would be very good. I don't think I was wildly off with a whole bunch of cards, but there are some places where I was. So let's dive in and talk about them. As usual, I'm going to be using 17 Lands data to sort of supplement what I'm talking about here. You can go to 17lands.com and have them track your Magic Arena data. It is, in a lot of ways, more useful than your own personal experience ever can be, just because you get a look at more reps with specific cards, because it's all of these people's data, how these cards are performing, not just how they're performing for you, which is generally going to be somewhat anecdotal at least, but obviously how you feel about a card should sort of be a fusion of how you feel it's performed and the data. And the data is not the end-all, be-all. Drafting is very context-specific. It doesn't mean you should always take the higher win rate card over the lower win rate card. Kind of should with your first pick in most cases. But after that, things start to get more complicated as you have certain synergies and other things. You really need 2-drops or whatever. Things start to change as the draft goes on. The overall win rate in this set, to keep in mind, is 55.7% for 17 Lands users. That number is higher than 50%, which is what it would be for all of the Magic community, because 17 Lands users have a higher overall win rate than your average non-17 Lands user. These are people who are really interested in how cards are performing and how to get better at draft, so it makes sense. So that's sort of the baseline to keep in mind as I show you win percentages. They aren't quite as insane as they sound just because they're above 50%. In fact, just barely above 50% isn't good in this case. All right, so let's go ahead and dive right in with a look at these cards. And we're going to start with the 3 lower rarity cards with airbending, all of which I got wrong. And that's definitely my biggest miss in the set. Airbending is way better than I thought it would be, as these 3 cards can attest. Those cards are Aang the Last Airbender, Glider Staff, and Airbending Lesson. So Aang is the best of these with its 62.3% win rate, which is insanely high for an uncommon. We don't see very many uncommons with that high of a win rate, and that's a recurring theme in this set. There are tons of super powerful uncommons. I've heard people call this a pauper or a prince set rather, and I think it's true to an extent, but I think the fact that there are lower rarity cards with win rates on par with the rares and mythics balances that a little bit. Problem is, a lot of them are in white or blue, which are already powerful colors. And Aang the Last Airbender is one of these. In the set review, I questioned, he's a 4-mana 3/2 flyer. How good is this interest trigger? And I thought it would be pretty good, but not amazing. So I only gave him a C+. I didn't love his low toughness. We've seen a lot of 4-mana 3/2 flyers be absolute duds. And this set has Firebending Lesson, which can kill Aang for 1 mana. But by the time you're doing that, Aang has already delivered you the interest trigger, and I don't think Airbending's quite worth a full card all on its own, but when you get a body alongside it, or an equipment alongside it, or you draw a card alongside it, which is what the other 2 Airbending cards we're about to look at do, you're getting more than a card worth of value. Aang also has the most flexible form of it. He can airbend any non-land permanent. Doesn't have to be yours, doesn't have to be a creature. It can be any non-land permanent, which really opens the door. Most of the time, I'd say, 7 times out of 10, when you airbend something of your opponent's to get it out of the way to get tempo. Tempo's big in this set, and that's part of what makes airbending so good, because it's just so great to get your opponent's creature out of the way for a turn, make them cast it again, and you get to reap the reward from that immediately a lot of the time by just attacking, because this is a format where curving out, especially in white, and just attacking and playing a card like this, getting a thing out of the way, continuing to attack, it can just be game over if somebody curves out and then just plays Aang. And that's kind of crazy. That's how good airbending is. It also has the flexibility to do all this other stuff, right? You can go after your own stuff, which you do sometimes, like if your creature is locked down by an aura or has a powerful enters trigger you want to get again. Sometimes you need like weird pseudo vigilance. Sometimes you just want to do that. But most of the time, it goes after an opponent's creature, and that ends up having a huge impact on the turn, and then even beyond that turn. Another thing that makes Aang even better is that flyers in this set are just great. Like, there's not very many really good, like, cheap reach creatures, anything that can, on the ground, do a great job against flyers. Like, the best you're going to do is a 3-mana 2/3 reach guy who also has Death Touch. Like, that's the best you're going to do. And trading one of those, isn't, you're not sad about that happening. You're a little bit behind on mana maybe, but you airbent something, so you definitely come out ahead. Plus, you can airbend those things out of the way. But removal is poor enough in this format that, like, any creature with flying, because of all the tempo available, especially in blue-white, can just be a win condition. And that has made Aang even better, too. He also has lifelink a decent chunk of the time, and, that certainly matters. He just does a lot of stuff. The biggest thing is just that airbend is super good. It's a great tempo mechanic, which is what it is most of the time. And Aang the Last Airbender showcases that because it's not a C+, it's just an A. It's on par with some of the biggest bombs in the set, despite being an uncommon. Next, let's look at Glider's Staff. This is the one that I may have been the wrongest about because I gave it a D+ in the set review. So again, I was like, a 3-mana equipment that gives +1/+1 in flying when you equip it, and it equips for 2. We've seen that before. It hasn't been that good in limited. It's not terrible. It's like a D- level card. You can use it in some longer games to find a way to get in through the air, but you do kind of need your creature to be somewhat significant for it to really matter. And so I said, it's definitely better because it airbends when it enters, but it's still not very good. And so I gave it a D+. So not good, right? That's not a great place to that basically means you're only going to run this when you're desperate. However, with its win rate of 59.4%, it's more like a B. So it is one of the better uncommons. It does pale in comparison to Aang the Last Airbender and another uncommon we're going to look at shortly, but it's up there. It's very good, and it kind of the same reasons. Airbending's better, flying's better. Both of those things being big have made Glider Staff really good. Can turn any creature into a win condition. There are, I was talking about with Aang, sometimes you get the reach creature out of the way with when you use airbending. Well, with this, if you have the mana, you can play it, get something out of the way, equip a thing, and then send it in the air unblocked. And that, happens reasonably often with Glider Staff. It doesn't hurt that it's good with waterbend and stuff like that. I mean, I knew that would be the case, that it would be useful, because an equipment is a free resource to tap, basically, because it's not something that really matters when it's tapped. But the biggest thing is just it's on what it does on a base level without taking any synergy into account whatsoever. It's just way better in this set, between airbending just being better than I thought it would be and the fact that flyers are really good here. And then there's Airbending Lesson. So this one I was the least wrong about, interestingly. I gave it a C. I thought the fact that it draws you a card plus the airbend, which is flexible, and you could use it to... This is one you do use a little more often on your own stuff because it's an instant and you have the mana up during your opponent's turn. You use it less often on your opponent's stuff, but you still do sometimes. But I thought the fact it replaced itself, has a lesson subtype, would all make it perfectly solid. But it's more than that. It's like a B-. It's one of the best commons in the set. It is hard to really think about, like, what exactly does airbend give you, like, in terms of cards. And that was the thing. Like, how much worse is Aang the Last Airbender than Banisher Priest? Is kind of the effect, right? And the answer is not that much worse, and it has more upside beyond it that may just make it a wash. Like, I don't think that's quite true. I feel like a 4-mana 3/2 flyer that just exiles a creature straight up until it leaves the battlefield. That's probably an A+ instead of just an A, so it's probably a little bit better, but it's not by a lot, right? And that's not something that I foresaw. So let's continue this theme of super strong uncommons with a look at Invasion Submersible. This is a card I loved in the set review. I gave it a straight up B, said it was Blue's best uncommon. That last part's correct. However, It is the highest win rate uncommon in the set, has like the 5th highest win rate of any card in the set. So, I didn't expect that. It has a 63.1% win rate. That's 0.8% higher than Aang the Last Airbender, which I already just noted. Super high win rate for an uncommon. And Invasion Submersible, even higher. And this is another card that really illustrates that tempo thing, man. Like, you play this and bounce something, and that can be real bad in a format where people are curving out. And the reason I liked it in the set review has proven to be true. A lot of the time, this just feels like a 3-mana 3/3 that bounces something, which is an excellent Magic card because it's not that hard to waterbend, and it really isn't. You can tap it, and that makes it a lot easier to waterbend. And you end up with this 3/3 body, which, it's not a world beater, but in a format where bounce is as good as it is in this set, having this creature that's also an artifact that can be, tapped for waterbending even when it's not a creature. You have a lot of good stuff going on here with Invasion Submersible, and you have a format where tempo, curving out is like, king, really. Like, you need to be doing it. And blue and white are like the best colors in the set, and it's because they have cards like Aang the Last Airbender and Invasion Submersible, absurd uncommons that can turn the game on their head single-handedly. So we talked about some uncommons that I underrated, at least with Invasion Submersible. I knew it would be really good, so I got that one right. Not so much Aang the Last Airbender. I didn't get it right in that it's one of the best cards in the set, period. But let's talk about a couple uncommons I was wrong about the other way, that I overrated in a big way in some cases. So let's start with Leaves from the Vine, which I gave a B+ in this set review. You look at this thing, 2-mana saga. We've seen so many 2-mana sagas that kind of don't look that great, but you're like, in the end, I get a food token, I get 2 counters, and I draw a card. That's what this is going to do for me for 2 mana. That sounds pretty good, and I think there are formats where this would have been good. Maybe a B+ is overrating in general, since this is an awkward turn 2 play, because you're probably not getting more than 1 counter, and you may not even get that on turn 2. So it's more of a later game play, which sort of counteracts some of what makes it good, that it's so cheap. But in this format, you really need to add to the board on turn 2. This doesn't do it. Like, if you don't play a 1-drop and then you play this, you are usually pretty far behind. And that's a pretty big problem in this set, even if you do eventually get more value out of it. This just isn't a set where you can play these like grindy sagas and have them be really good. Like, you need to play this on like turn 4. You've got a built out board. You got stuff going on. Now you can play it. And you just can't have that many cards that are like that in this format, especially, that aren't good on it. They don't add to the board on their own. A food token's not enough, right? So it ends up being too slow, and it is much worse than a B+. It has a 53.3% win rate. Remember, the average win rate's 55.7% for 17 lands users. So this is like a D. I think you can play it in some green decks if you do somehow end up in a grindier one. If you have some big bombs that this can help you get to the late game with a little bit better, I guess. But you still, even if you're in a slower deck in this format, you've got to be playing things that add to the board early. It doesn't, and that ends up being a big problem. The other green uncommon I was wildly wrong about is Sparring Dummy. It is a card I gave a B- to. I thought this would basically feel, and it can kind of be this way, I thought it would be a 2-mana 1/3 that basically says tap, draw a card about half the time, right? I thought that's what this would be doing. And it can. There are definitely formats where I think this would actually be a B-level card. I think in like a lot of Innistrad sets where you do just sort of grind out value by milling things to the graveyard. Like if we had this in Duskmourn, for example, it would have been pretty good. There are formats where this would be good, but it's not this one. It does at least add to the board, right? But it is slow, and you need time to use it. It's not a good blocker. This is a world where there are 2-mana 3/2s and 2-mana 1/2s even that can attack into this without being worried at all. It's just not good at stopping anything from attacking it for the most part. And you just don't have the time to have a card that doesn't pressure your opponent at all and will occasionally draw you a card or occasionally gain you 2 life. Like, that's what it does, but you don't have the time for that. Like, in this format, I think a 2-mana 2/2 that did nothing else is probably better than Sparring Dummy. Like, that's just kind of thing you need. You need a thing that can trade off for their 2-drops. You need the kind of thing that can attack them, and you can use your tricks on. You can use tempo to make sure it gets its hit in. That's what the format is. And a card like Sparring Dummy just doesn't fit in a format like this. And it's like a D-, and I'd probably listen to an F. It's just not the right format for Sparring Dummy. We'll look at a similar card because I think the comparison's interesting now, and that is Gran Gran. I thought she'd be solid. I liked that. You could play her on 1, attack with her, looting's good. I knew that you could waterbend and draw cards with her. I did underrate her lesson payoff. I underrated most of those, not as wildly as airbending, but I talked a little bit about that last week, and we'll talk a little bit more. There are 2 other cards in this video that are lesson payoffs. I didn't think you'd be able to get to her lesson payoff all that easily because she needs 3 cards in there. And I'm like, by that point, how great is it that she gives you a discount? Well, it is true that it's not automatic to get 3 into your graveyard, and she doesn't always get there. But she does end up being able to draw loot a lot in this format. Like, she gives you this 1 mana, 1/2 body. You can play on turn 1. Even an okay way to pressure your opponent, like if you're going first, especially because you're looting, you're going to smooth out your draws, you're going to load your graveyard with lessons and stuff. And then you can waterbend with her, but that's even better than I expected. Like, you can just do it so effortlessly. Like, tapping Gran Gran is so easy. Like, it's not hard to do at all. So both her lesson payoff is slightly better than I expected it to be, and she is even easier to tap than I expected, even accounting for waterbending. Like, couldn't really account for how much this little 1-drop can give you. I mean, it often feels like she's a 1 mana, 1/2 that loots 3 times a game, right? That's so much value for 1 mana, and that's what she ends up being. She gets interesting too if you give her flying with the equipment we talked about earlier, because then she's even easier to loot with. So, almost feels like Connive. She's very good. So good that she has a 60.2% win rate. She's not as high as Aang or Invasion Submersible, but she's high. Like, it would have been hard to convince me that this 1 mana, 1/2 is one of the best uncommons in the set going into this format, but it is. It's, one of the, 25, 30 highest win rates of any card in the set. So yeah, that's the kind of format it is. 1-drops and 2-drops that add to the board are important, and if they give you extra stuff, they're amazing. So speaking of 1-drops and 2-drops that add to the board and can give you some extra stuff, let's look at a couple more lesson payoffs. I talked a little bit about these last week, and those are Fire Nation Cadets and First Time Flyer. I wasn't wildly wrong about either of these. It's not like D+ to B territory. They're both still in the same letter grade overall, I think, but I thought both of these were going to be C-. The Fire Nation Cadets is a 1-drop that you'll play if you're really aggressive, but you're kind of hoping for something better. And First Time Flyer is a 2-drop that you'll play if you really need a 2-drop, but you can probably find something better. And that's not really true. Like, they're both really good 1-drop and 2-drop. So Fire Nation Cadets, it's way easier to get at firebending than I expected. So the thing that made me not like this card a lot is how many 1 mana 1/1s, 1 mana 1/2s we've seen over the years that can just buff their power for mana. Those just usually play really poorly because your opponent just blocks with their 2/2, and you have to sink 2 mana into the cadets just to kill it. And that's a trade, but you come out behind on mana, and it just gets worse as creatures get bigger. And that is why this kind of card hasn't been good in the past. I knew that if you could give it firebending, it could buff itself, and it wouldn't really feel like you were paying real mana. But that comes up way more often than I thought it would. It's way easier to give it firebending on its own. You often have other firebending mana to get the cadets going. So, it ends up with a win rate of 56.6%. Not insane, but it's like a C+. Like, this is a 1 mana card that you're going to play happily in most red decks in the format. Again, these lower curve cards that add to the board are all just better than they looked because they do that, pretty much. First Time Flyer is similar. Like I said, gave it a C-, and it has a win rate of 56.7%, so a little higher than the cadets, and it's also about a C+. So it's both way easier. Like, this is a 2 mana 2/3 flyer a massive chunk of the time, first of all. Second of all, it is a flyer. And flying plays, like I've said, super well in the format. And a 2/3 flyer is pretty sizable, especially for the cost. Like, there might be a lot of flyers in the format, but most of them aren't that big. You know, they're all over the place, but they're mostly like 2/3 or smaller. And so having your own 2/3 for 2 mana is pretty good. All right, let's look now at Avatar Enthusiasts. So this is a card I gave a D+ to, and here's why. So we see 3 mana 2/2s in like every set, right? And that do something, that grow when X happens. Okay, we've seen so many of them, and they're almost always bad. They're almost always cards that aren't really worth playing. They're Ds at best. And that's because they start out so inefficiently. When you spend 3 mana on a 2/2 and your opponent can just attack into it with their 1-drop, their 2/1, you know, because those are around these days, and you have to just take the hit, like that's a real cost. Trading off for things with it that are comparable mana aren't that easy. And then you've got your firebending lessons and the like that can kill it for only 1 mana, which also feels terrible. Well, those things are all smaller problems in this set. Removal's worse. Like, firebending lesson is pretty much the only like really cheap removal spell that can kill this and make you feel really bad about it. It happens, but it's not the end of the world because there's not also like a stab or something like that in the format that really hedges it out. And you know, the thing that this does is just so easy to do. Like, they're almost every deck, like especially like red, white, blue, white, green, white. You're going to look at your deck and be like, oh, I have 13 allies and 3 of them make multiple bodies, right? And that ends up making this thing huge. You know, it counts tokens. So it ends up growing quickly. It does, you know, it's not an amazing card by any stretch. That's not what I'm saying. But I gave it a D+ in the set review, and it's not. It has a win rate right around the average win rate, 55.9%. It's a solid C. Like, it's a card you end up playing a couple of in a lot of your white decks, because especially when you have those cards that make multiple ally bodies, because it just ends up growing. You know, it does still have this point where it feels bad. Sometimes you can't hit an ally. It's not the greatest top deck. There are problems with the card. It's not great. It has the problems I foresaw. They just don't matter as much. And it's a lot easier to grow than I expected. I will say, the other 3 mana 2/2s in this set at lower rarities that grow when something happens are bad. They haven't panned out. Gave those Ds too, and that's what they've been. So, you know, I was wrong about one of them, but most of the time when we see one of these, it is pretty easy to say, yeah, it's not going to be good. It just starts too weak. And the one in this set that grows when you sacrifice a permanent isn't good. And the one that grows when you cast a non-creature spell isn't good. Neither of those, both of those are as bad as I expected, but Avatar Enthusiasts is not. It's a nice solid card for white decks. Let's look now at June Bounty Hunter. So this is one I was really high on. You know, it's another in this Leaves from the Vine sparring dummy category. It's not quite as bad. But I gave her a B. You know, I compared her to Vampire Gourmand, which was like an amazing card. One of the best uncommons, maybe the best uncommon. I'd have to look at the data to remember for sure. In Foundations, you know, it was a 2 mana 2/2. It could attack. You could sack a creature when it attacked and it became unblockable and you drew a card. Awesome. That format had tons of sacrifice fodder. June, not exactly the same, but she's a 2 mana 2/2 that is unblockable if you draw on your second card in a turn. She can sacrifice creatures to make clues. So there you have a way to trigger it. So it's like an extra step from Vampire Gourmand, but it's kind of similar, right? Well, no. It does turn out that that extra step is a big enough deal that she's not great. And I'll say overall, you know, black is a subpar color in this set. Black and green are the ones that really lag behind. Red's kind of in the middle. Blue and white are really at the top. And black and green sort of lag. I mean, there's not any color you should avoid entirely, but the best decks are in the Jeskai colors, and they're going to be, on average, your decks are going to be less good in green and black. If they're really open, you can still draft really good decks, but that does drive down a card's win rate. You know, that's one of the flaws of data is colors with higher win rates collectively. How much of their win rate is a result of other really good cards being around and how much of their win rate is just their own. And there's no way to fully measure that. We have to sort of correct for it and think about it. And I do think it makes June's win rate worse. You know, she needs this extra setup to get going. And so, you know, she's got a win rate of 55.2%. She's more like a C, maybe even a C minus if you want to go really low on her. She's just not a good enough 2-drop at pressuring your opponent and needs enough extra help that she's nothing special. She's just an okay card in the end. So a minute ago, I basically alluded to this next card, Fire Nation Raider. So this is a card that really interested me in the set review because it's a 4-mana 4/2 that makes a clue when it enters if you attack that turn. That's important. So in the set review, I noted every time we looked at a raid card that raid is always harder to trigger than you think it is. And it is. Cards, it's never easy. The other cards with raid in this set haven't been very good either. They need a really good baseline to get there, and this doesn't. But what intrigued me here is that if this were a 4-mana 4/2 that made a clue when it enters, period, no raid at all, it'd be like a B. That's just a great card. It gives you a 2-for-1, gives you a body that can swing hard and can trade off for things. That's really good. That is that's what the ceiling is here, but the floor is a 4-mana 4/2, which is like an F. That's just not on. It's not what you want to be spending mana on just for one card that is that weak and can't block 2 drops effectively. That's a problem. And so I was like, if raid is even easier to trigger, like really easy to trigger, this is going to be amazing. So it's a card to keep an eye on. If it's not, it's going to be terrible. And so I sort of gave it a C. That was sort of my placeholder grade. It's terrible. It has a 51.1% win rate. That's just an F. You don't get the clue often enough. I've played, and this is one area where it's important to really think about the fact that this is a much larger sample size. I've played with Fire Nation Raider in decks, and I've had it feel good because it makes a clue like 80% of the time. And that's cool and all. But I've also played against lots of people where it doesn't get the clue, that it looks terrible. And I've played it without getting the clue and it feels terrible. And clearly that's what's happening more than anything based on the win rate, because the chasm between the ceiling and the floor on this card is massive. And it turns out the floor is just too big of a problem to overcome. And it just ends up being an F. All right, the last card I want to look at is what appears to be the best common in this set, and that is Lost Days. So I like this card. I'm always a proponent of the usually 4-mana bounce a creature either to the top or bottom of your opponent's library card. I'm always a pretty big fan of that. And that card, it always does end up being one of blue's best commons. It's not usually number one. It's usually like the second best or third best blue common. It usually has a respectable 56.8, 57.2% win rate, something like that. With that in mind, I gave this one a C+. Thinking it'd be a good common, but not like amazing. And I did like that it makes you a clue, and that it's a lesson, and that it puts the card, if your opponent chooses to, it puts it second into their library. And all of that, I was like, yeah, once you get all of that, it is worth the 1 additional mana that it costs you. But there's one thing I overlooked that I didn't really think about, and that is that this is one of very few ways in the set to remove an earth-bent land without any of the annoying fact that you lose a ton of value. Like, you still lose some because Earthbend isn't usually a whole card, it's usually part of a card. But if they've put a bunch of Earthbend counters on one thing, this can actually hit it. You can actually use Lost Days, put that thing into their deck, and them drawing a land again at that stage usually isn't very good. And so they usually put it on the bottom, and you dealt with the card entirely. All the other removal in the set, and part of what makes it bad, is you point it at one of those lands, and it just doesn't feel very good, because your opponent still has the land, right? That extra step that they added, which also makes that mechanic interesting for sacrifice stuff, really made Earthbend significantly better. And Lost Days being able to deal with that is great. It also just turns out that the 2 deeper thing is probably even better than I expected it to be. Being a lesson is even better than I expected. I like that it was one in the set review, but I thought it mattered less on a card that wasn't a super cheap lesson, because getting 1 lesson in your graveyard early is what you want to do, and this doesn't help you do it, but sometimes it's your 3rd lesson that gets your grand going or whatever. So it ends up being really good. I mean, interaction, instant speed interaction is important in this format because of all the tricks and all the tempo. And even though this is kind of expensive, the fact it's an instant opens up the door for blowouts, gives you a way to deal with earthbent lands that otherwise is a real pain to do. And, it just grants you that 2-for-1 in the late game. You often just untap, crack the clue, and find some gas that you really needed. So it ends up being really good in this format. It's, like the best removal spell in the format. I mean, Heartless Act is in that conversation. That one's not surprising. But Lost Days is up there with it. 2 mana removal versus 5 mana removal. Yeah, you can see you could pay 3 more mana for it, but it does do a lot of work. So those are like the big things I got wrong, broadly. I was wrong about airbending. It's interesting. I think I did reasonably well on the higher rarity cards with airbending. Those were easy, like Aang, the 3 mana 2/3/1. I gave that one an A-. It's probably more like a solid A or an A+, but that's not wildly wrong, right? But those other airbending cards, yeah, that was a bad mechanic to underrate, but it was a hard one to evaluate, I think. So I'm cutting myself some slack. All right, that does it for this edition of Needs and Notes. In the next one, next week, I'll take a look at some more data, and we'll look at cards that are being overrated, cards that are being taken way too highly based on how they're actually performing. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to catch future editions of Needs and Notes, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on past episodes, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.